Have you noticed how some people don't really live out there, but inside, you see them sitting across from you, nodding at the right moments, eyes focused, body present, yet something about them feels distant, as if their real life is happening somewhere behind their eyes. While the world moves forward in real time, they are replaying a conversation from years ago, imagining how it should have gone, or rehearsing a future moment that may never arrive. Their mind is always one step ahead or one step behind, rarely here. You know this feeling intimately because it often feels like you. Your days are narrated instead of lived. Every action is analyzed, every emotion translated into language before it is ever allowed to breathe. Even joy passes through your thoughts first, like it needs permission to exist. And slowly, without realizing it, your inner world becomes more vivid than the one outside your body. There is comfort in this place. Inside your head, you can pause time. You can control the story. You can rewrite endings, soften rejection, prepare for danger before it happens. Neuroscience calls this the default mode network, the part of the brain that constructs identity, memory, and imagined futures. It's always active when the outside world feels uncertain. When life feels unpredictable, the mind steps in like a vigilant guardian saying, I'll think for you so you don't have to feel. But protection has a cost. What starts as refuge slowly becomes a room you never leave. You may notice it in small moments. Standing in a crowd but feeling invisible, listening to someone you care about while mentally drifting elsewhere. Or lying awake at night replaying things that cannot be changed. Attachment theory tells us that when connection once felt unsafe or unreliable, the nervous system learns to retreat inward. Thinking becomes the substitute for closeness. Observation replaces participation. As a child, you may have learned that being quiet, reflective, and self-contained was safer than being expressive. Maybe emotions weren't welcomed. Maybe you had to grow up early or disappear emotionally to survive. So you built a rich inner life instead, a private world where you could make sense of chaos, where no one interrupted your thoughts or misunderstood your feelings. The mind became your mask, your shield, your companion. But now, as an adult, that same shield can feel like glass. You see life happening, relationships, risks, moments that demand presence, yet you experience them at a distance, like a traveler watching the landscape through a window, untouched by the air, unmoved by the ground beneath their feet. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet question begins to form. What happens when thinking replaces living? When the place that once protected you becomes the place you hide? This retreat didn't begin with weakness or choice. It began much earlier, quietly, when safety mattered more than presence, and thinking felt like the only way to survive. Have you ever wondered why thinking feels safer than feeling? Why retreating inward seems almost automatic, as if it were learned before you could name it? Long before it became a habit, it was a solution. Somewhere early in your life, the world taught you, quietly, that being present was risky, but being inside your head was survivable. Picture a child sitting alone in a small room, toys scattered but untouched, not because they lack imagination, but because their imagination has already gone elsewhere. The sounds of the house leak through the walls, voices rising, silences stretching too long, moods changing without warning. In that space, the child learns to observe rather than participate. They learn to read the air, to anticipate reactions, to stay small. Attachment theory tells us that when caregivers are unpredictable, emotionally distant, or overwhelming, a child adapts not by demanding more, but by needing less. And so you learn to disappear inward. Maybe emotions weren't dangerous, just inconvenient. Maybe sadness was brushed aside, anger misunderstood, curiosity interrupted. You learned quickly that your inner dialogue was the only place where questions could exist without consequences. Neuroscience shows that a child's brain is extraordinarily plastic, shaping itself around what feels safest. When external connection feels unreliable, the default mode network, the system responsible for imagination, memory, and self-talk, becomes a refuge. Your thoughts became companions. Your inner voice became a parent, a friend, a guide. You told yourself stories to make sense of things. You replayed moments to understand what went wrong. You imagined futures where you were finally seen, finally calm, finally safe. This wasn't fantasy for pleasure. It was survival. Like a garden growing indoors because the outside weather was too harsh, your inner world flourished while the outer one remained uncertain. But survival leaves marks. Overthinking wasn't indecision, it was vigilance. Daydreaming wasn't laziness, it was relief. Silence wasn't emptiness, it was control. You learned to wear a mask of composure, while a shadow of unspoken feelings followed you quietly, waiting for a moment when it would be allowed to exist. As you grew older, the room changed, but the habit stayed. The child who learned to retreat became an adult, who over-prepares, over-analyzes, and hesitates at the edge of life. What once kept you safe now feels like a wall you don't remember building. And yet, it makes sense. You didn't choose this path because it was comfortable. You chose it because, once upon a time, it was the only place where you felt protected. This coping strategy never vanished. It simply evolved, adapting to new roles, new relationships, new fears. And before you realized it, the place that once saved you quietly began shaping the person you became. At some point, you realized that people often describe you as thoughtful, intelligent, insightful, and yet, strangely, disconnected. Have you noticed how you can explain life in stunning detail, analyze emotions with precision, and understand people deeply while feeling like you're standing a few inches outside your own existence? It's as if you're watching yourself live rather than fully living at all. You learned how to wear this mask well, the mask of intellect. Behind it, you appear composed, reflective, even wise. You speak carefully. You think before you act. You rarely make impulsive mistakes, but inside there is glass between you and the world. You observe relationships instead of stepping fully into them. You rehearse conversations late at night, imagining how honest moments might unfold, yet when the moment arrives, you retreat into silence or polite distance. Life becomes commentary. You narrate experiences instead of surrendering to them. In relationships, this shows up quietly. You can sense emotional shifts instantly, read between every line, predict conflict before it begins. Attachment theory would call this hypervigilance, an adaptation learned early when closeness felt unpredictable. So instead of risking raw presence, you monitor from afar. You love deeply but cautiously. You feel intensely but privately. The monster within isn't anger or cruelty, it's fear of exposure, fear that being fully seen will cost more than it gives. Your imagination remains vivid, sometimes more alive than reality itself. In your mind, you're bold, expressive, decisive. You replay arguments you never had, picture versions of yourself who spoke up, walked away, or finally chose differently. Neuroscience suggests that the brain often can't distinguish imagined action from real rehearsal, which is why thinking feels productive, even when nothing changes. Planning becomes a substitute for movement. Insight replaces risk. Over time, this inner world hardens into identity. You tell yourself and others that you're simply a thinker, an observer, someone who needs time. And maybe that's partly true, but there's a quiet cost. The garden of your life begins to dry, not from neglect, but from over-control. Nothing grows wild, nothing surprises you. Even joy is filtered, examined, and softened before it reaches your body. There are moments when you catch it, standing in a room full of people yet feeling invisible, or lying beside someone you care about while miles away in your thoughts. Loneliness doesn't scream in you, it hums. Resentment doesn't explode, it settles like dust. You don't feel broken, you feel paused, and eventually a deeper question surfaces beneath all the self-awareness and explanations. Is this simply who you are, a personality trait to accept and manage, or is something more fundamental happening beneath the surface of your thoughts, shaping how your brain learned to survive? The answer doesn't live in philosophy alone. It waits in the quiet mechanics of the mind itself. Have you ever noticed how thinking feels active, even when nothing in your life is moving? How hours can pass while you replay the same memories, imagine the same futures, or analyze the same emotions, yet your body remains still, untouched by experience. This isn't because you lack discipline or courage, it's because your brain learned a very specific way to keep you safe. Neuroscience offers a quiet explanation. When the external world feels uncertain, emotionally risky, or overwhelming, the brain shifts inward. The default mode network, the system responsible for self reflection, memory, imagination, and narrative, becomes overactive. It's the mental space where you construct meaning, identity, and what if scenarios. In small doses, this network helps you plan, empathize, and learn. But when it dominates, thought stops being a tool and becomes a loop. Rumination is one name psychology gives to this pattern. It's not problem solving, it's repetition without resolution. You revisit the same emotional terrain again and again, hoping insight will finally dissolve the pain. But each pass only deepens the grooves. Studies show that chronic rumination heightens anxiety, lowers mood, and narrows attention. Your mind becomes like a record skipping, not broken, just stuck. Dissociation plays a quieter role. When emotions once felt too intense or unsafe, your nervous system learned to step back from direct experience. Instead of feeling, you observe. Instead of acting, you imagine. Maladaptive daydreaming is not escapism for pleasure. It's simulation for survival. Your brain rewards imagined action because it carries none of the risk of real engagement. Dopamine is released not for doing, but for thinking about doing. This is why planning can feel productive while action feels terrifying. In your inner world, you control the variables, you can pause discomfort, you can rewrite endings. But in the body, in the present moment, there is uncertainty, and your nervous system remembers a time when uncertainty hurt. Attachment theory explains this as an adaptation. When connection once felt unreliable, your system learned to rely on cognition instead. Thought became the oxygen mask. Over time, this rewires motivation itself. Attention turns inward by default. Emotions are filtered through analysis. Even desire is questioned before it's felt. The garden of your inner life grows dense with ideas and interpretations, while the outer soil remains dry. You don't lack depth, you drown in it. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone, it comes from never fully arriving. And here is the most important truth science quietly confirms. This pattern is not weakness, it is intelligence shaped by threat, a nervous system doing its best with the tools it was given. But strategies meant for survival are not always meant for living. So the question begins to shift. If this loop once protected you, what happens when it never turns off? When the mind that saved you from pain slowly becomes the place where pain endlessly repeats, that is where the shadow of overthinking begins to lengthen, and where the cost of staying inside your head starts to reveal itself. Have you ever felt exhausted without having done anything at all, as if an entire life played out inside you while the world barely noticed you were there? This is the shadow that forms when the mind becomes the only place you live. What once felt like safety slowly turns into something colder, heavier, like walls rising quietly around you, thought by thought. At first, the prison doesn't look like a prison. It looks like intelligence, caution, self-control. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful, measured, prepared. But over time, movement becomes harder. Spontaneity feels dangerous. Joy feels suspicious. You hesitate before every step, not because you don't want life, but because your mind insists on checking every possible outcome first. And while you're checking, life moves on without you. You feel this most clearly in the body. Emotions arrive faintly, as if filtered through layers of glass. Neuroscience shows that chronic overthinking pulls attention away from sensory experience and into abstract evaluation. The nervous system stays in a low-grade freeze, alert but immobile. You are awake, yet numb, present, yet absent. The monster within is not chaos, it is paralysis disguised as wisdom. In relationships, the cost becomes painfully clear. You sit across from someone who wants closeness, and instead of leaning in, you retreat into interpretation. You analyze their tone, their pauses, their intentions. Attachment theory would say your system learned that closeness carries risk, so you keep it intellectual. You love from a distance, safely, but safety begins to feel like isolation. Loneliness settles in not with drama, but with silence. There is resentment too, though you rarely admit it. You watch others act freely, speak without rehearsing, make mistakes, and survive them. A part of you envies their recklessness, even as another part judges it. Inside, your imagination runs wild with versions of a life you might have lived. Paths not taken, words not spoken, chances missed because you were waiting to be certain. The garden inside your mind grows thick and tangled, while the soil of reality remains dry, untouched by risk. Time itself begins to blur. Days collapse into thoughts. Years pass without landmarks. You remember thinking a lot but living very little. And the cruelest paradox reveals itself slowly. The mind that once protected you from pain is now the very thing keeping you from feeling alive. The cage was built to keep danger out, but it also kept you in. This is where the shadow fully emerges, not as something evil, but as something overused, a strategy stretched far beyond its purpose. And as heavy as this realization is, it carries an uncomfortable truth. You didn't fail yourself. You adapted too well, but the story doesn't end inside you alone, because this prison is not built in isolation. The world outside has been quietly applauding the bars, mistaking stillness for strength, restraint for maturity, and distance for depth. And to understand why leaving this prison feels so hard, you have to look beyond your mind and toward the culture that taught you to stay there. Have you noticed how the world seems to nod approvingly when you stay quiet, controlled, and endlessly reflective? How stillness is mistaken for depth, restraint for wisdom, and distance for maturity. Long before you question your inner prison, society quietly furnished it for you, praising the very habits that keep you inside your head. From early on, you were taught that thinking is safer than feeling. Schools reward analysis, not presence. Workplaces celebrate productivity, not embodiment. You learn to sit still, suppress impulse, organize your thoughts, and keep your emotions tidy. The child who once retreated inward to survive now discovers that retreat is applauded. The mask of intellect fits perfectly in a world that values composure over connection. Technology deepens this conditioning. Your life becomes something you curate rather than inhabit. Social media invites you to narrate yourself endlessly, turning experience into content and emotion into commentary. You watch others live while refining your own inner monologue, comparing imagined versions of yourself to carefully edited lives on a screen. Neuroscience shows that constant information overload fragments attention, pulling you further into abstraction and away from the body. Presence becomes inefficient, reflection becomes infinite. Philosophically, the culture leans towards spectatorship. We are encouraged to observe, critique, analyze, and optimize, but rarely to feel deeply or risk being changed by experience. Emotional restraint is praised as strength, vulnerability dismissed as excess. The good person is thoughtful, calm, self-contained. Attachment theory would note how this mirrors early emotional distancing. Connection becomes conditional, controlled, and intellectualized. You learn to earn belonging by being impressive rather than present. In relationships, this plays out subtly. You are valued for your insight, your listening, your steadiness, but your silence is misread as peace. Your distance is mistaken for depth. Over time, you begin to believe the lie yourself, that feeling less makes you more evolved. Yet inside, the shadow grows restless. The monster within is not desire, but deprivation. A hunger for unscripted moments, for messiness, for contact that doesn't require translation. The garden of your inner life grows manicured and controlled, trimmed of wild emotion. But outside, the soil remains untouched. You watch others laugh loudly, argue openly, love clumsily, and a quiet resentment flickers, not because they are reckless, but because they are alive in ways you were taught to restrain. Loneliness settles in not from lack of people, but from lack of permission to arrive as you are. This world did not trap you by accident. It rewarded you for building the cage, one thoughtful brick at a time. And as comforting as that approval can feel, it carries a hidden cost, because when a culture teaches you to live in your head, it rarely teaches you how to come back out. And slowly, beneath the praise and the polish, another truth begins to surface. The problem was never just the world outside. It was the quiet toll this way of living has taken inside you, on your nervous system, your heart, your sense of being real, and that cost is waiting to be felt. Have you ever felt like your life is happening just slightly out of reach, close enough to see clearly, but too far away to touch, as if you were standing at the edge of your own existence, watching moments pass with a strange mix of awareness and absence? You feel everything deeply, yet somehow experience very little directly. This is the quiet grief that grows when living is replaced by observing. It doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in slowly, like dust. Anxiety becomes a constant background hum, not tied to any single danger, but to the sense that you are always preparing for something that never quite arrives. Your nervous system stays alert, scanning for meaning, for threat, for certainty. Neuroscience shows that when the brain remains locked in internal simulation, the body never fully relaxes. You are safe, yet never at rest. Loneliness follows, even when you are surrounded by people. You might sit in a room full of laughter and feel strangely detached, as if a pane of glass separates you from the warmth. In relationships, connection often feels imagined rather than lived. You understand others deeply, anticipate their needs, analyze their words, but intimacy feels theoretical. Attachment theory would say your closeness lives in your head, not your body. You think about love far more than you feel held by it. There are moments when derealization creeps in, subtle and unsettling. Time slips, days blur. You look back and struggle to remember what you actually did, only what you thought about doing. Life feels faint, like a dream you can't quite wake up from. The garden of your inner world is overflowing with insight and emotion, while the outer soil remains untouched, dry from lack of risk and presence. Resentment can surface in unexpected ways. You watch others stumble, fail, laugh too loudly, make impulsive choices, and survive. A part of you envies their messiness, another part judges it. But beneath both is grief. Grief for the conversations you rehearsed but never had, the chances you analyzed but didn't take, the versions of yourself that only existed in imagination. The monster within is not anger. It is sorrow for a life half lived. You may tell yourself that you chose this, that you are simply reflective, cautious, deep, but the truth is more tender. You adapted, you stayed safe, and now you carry the weight of all the moments that required presence instead of thought. The weight of unlived afternoons, untouched risks, unspoken truths. And yet, something important happens here. Because naming this grief changes it. Awareness cracks the glass. For the first time, you are not just thinking about your distance from life, you are feeling it. And that feeling, as heavy as it is, carries a quiet power, because the moment you can see what was lost is also the moment you realize something else might still be possible. What if the way forward was never about escaping your mind, but about coming back into your body? After years of living inside thought, this idea can feel almost frightening. You may wonder who you are without constant analysis, without narration, without the familiar voice explaining everything as it happens. But healing does not ask you to destroy the mind that once protected you. It asks you to gently take the crown off its head. You begin not with discipline, but with permission. Permission to feel before you understand. To notice the weight of your feet on the floor, the rise of your chest, the quiet signals your body has been sending for years while your attention was elsewhere. Neuroscience shows that presence is not an abstract concept, it is a physiological state. When attention returns to sensation, the nervous system slowly exits survival mode. Safety is no longer imagined, it is experienced. This can look deceptively simple. An adult choosing to act before certainty arrives, a conversation where you speak before rehearsing every possible outcome, a moment where you allow joy, anger, or sadness to move through you without translating it into insight. Attachment theory reminds us that secure connection is built not through perfect understanding, but through embodied responsiveness. You don't think your way into safety, you feel your way there. The child who once retreated inward needed control to survive. The adult you are now needs contact to live. That contact begins when you stop demanding perfection from yourself. Imperfect action becomes a bridge back to life. You do not wait to feel ready. You move, and readiness follows. The monster within, the fear of exposure, of being seen, softens when it realizes that mistakes are survivable and presence does not equal danger. Your mind still has a role. It becomes a tool, not a ruler. A guide that helps you reflect after experience, not a gatekeeper that decides whether experience is allowed. You set gentle limits on mental rehearsal, not with force, but with curiosity. You notice when thought spirals, and instead of following it, you return to breath, to sound, to movement. The garden inside you does not need pruning. It needs water from the outside world. There will be discomfort. Presence always carries risk. Feeling reawakens old grief, old longing, old fear. But it also reawakens something else, aliveness. The quiet satisfaction of being where you are. The relief of no longer watching life from behind glass. Compassion replaces self-correction. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What do I need right now?" This is not a dramatic transformation. It is a series of small returns, and each return teaches you something essential. You were never meant to live only in your head. Thought was a shelter, not a home. And as you slowly step back into the moment, another question begins to form, one that does not demand an answer, only reflection. If a life is not measured by how well it is understood, but by how deeply it is touched, what kind of life do you want to feel from here on? Have you ever noticed how easy it is to understand life without ever truly feeling it? How you can explain yourself with precision, trace every emotion to its origin, map your fears and patterns with clarity, and still feel strangely untouched by the days passing through you. This is the final illusion the mind offers, that knowing something deeply is the same as living it fully. You learned early that understanding brought safety. As a child, you watched closely, learned quickly, and thought deeply, because thinking helped you survive what you could not control. That intelligence stayed with you. It sharpened, it matured, it gave you language, insight, and self-awareness. But somewhere along the way, understanding quietly replaced experience. You began to observe life the way one studies weather, describing it accurately, yet never standing in the rain. Philosophy has always warned about this. Wisdom traditions across time have said the same thing in different ways. The map is not the territory. Neuroscience echoes it too. The brain's narratives, no matter how accurate, are representations, not reality itself. When you live primarily through thought, you're always one step removed from the body, from sensation, from the rawness of being alive. The mask of intellect feels refined, but it cannot kiss, cannot ache, cannot tremble. You may recognize this in small moments, sitting beside someone you love while your mind quietly analyzes the relationship instead of resting in it. Watching a sunset while mentally narrating its beauty instead of letting it soften you. Feeling sadness, joy, or longing arrive and immediately translating it into meaning, as if emotion needs permission to exist. The shadow here is subtle. You touch life with gloves on, careful not to feel too much. And yet, the mind is not the enemy. It never was. It is a brilliant guide, a storyteller, a protector, but it was never meant to be your home. When the mind becomes the place you live, life becomes an idea instead of an experience. The garden inside you grows thick with thought, while the world outside waits, quietly, to be entered. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when this truth lands not as an insight, but as a feeling. A soft ache, a realization that life does not need to be solved before it can be lived. That presence does not require certainty, that you are allowed to arrive imperfectly, unprepared, unscripted. The deepest shift is not intellectual, it is existential. You stop asking how to live correctly and begin asking how to live honestly. You stop narrating every step and begin taking them. And in that quiet movement, something loosens. The glass thins, the distance closes. Because in the end, life does not ask for your conclusions. It asks for your hands, your breath, your attention, not to be understood completely, but to be touched imperfectly while it is still here.